Now, as we get into Islam, I want to get into some of the practice and some of the ideas behind it in a fairly brief manner, but this is a culture that most of us don't have a strong foundation in. So before we can really look at the art, we need to understand its context, in this case, the culture and religion of Islam. Now, Islam sees itself as an Abrahamic religion, an Abrahamic faith. And this includes Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Abraham has two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is the progenitor of the Arab peoples, and that leads to Islam. Later, Islam will split into Sunni and Shia, not an issue that I'm going to get into here, but it is one that I could get into if people were really interested. On the other hand, we have Isaac. Isaac gives birth to Judaism. Judaism, of course, sees the development of Christianity as a sect of Judaism, and then moving to independence. Christianity then splits Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, and eventually Roman Catholicism splits from Protestantism. But these faiths are all closely related, and in fact, Islam will see the Jewish peoples and the Christians as people of the book, as people who are different from any other non-believer that they come across. The 5 pillars of Islam, the 5 basic tenets, are declaration of faith, prayer 5 times a day, charity, fasting during Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca, or the Hajj. Now, Islam spreads rapidly, and part of the reason for that is the trade routes that will run through these areas. Now, these trade routes allow for this new Islamic faith, these new ideas to spread rapidly. And you'll notice these trade routes run from China all the way through to Europe. And that's because they're right along the major trade routes of the Silk Road, the trade routes, the overland routes between North Africa and Europe. They're literally in the center of the known world at this point. And the Arabs at the time, prior to Islam, are nomadic herders. They're merchants on the fringe of the Roman, then the Byzantine and Persian empires. And we see a lot, they're in this massive conflict zone, not just now, today in the Middle East, but back in ancient times. We see the Persian Empire will redevelop during the Roman period. And this is the same Persians, more or less the same Persians that Alexander the Great defeated and became Greek. And now the Persian Empire redevelops and meets Rome right in the Middle East. As soon as Rome falls, we see the Byzantine people rising and constantly struggling against the Persians, again putting these Arab traders right in the middle of the action. And this is going to cause all sorts of issues. We see genocides, we see constant conflict, because of course that line is moving back and forth, that front is constantly moving. Now, getting into Muhammad and Muhammad's life, he's born. Very few people notice Muhammad's birth. He becomes an orphan. Eventually, he becomes a merchant or a trader. At age 25, he marries a widow. They have several children. This is all happening in Mecca. Now, Mecca is a major religious center prior to Islam because it's the home of the Kaaba, which was a center of pagan worship prior to Islam's development. And Muhammad in Mecca goes through sort of a general lifetime, nothing too unusual, until we get to about 610, when we start to see the revelations. God appears to him or speaks through him and gives him the revelations that will become the Quran later on. At some point, At one point, Muhammad escapes to Medina because his life is under threat. He's basically questioning all of the beliefs that the Arab peoples had had. And so this is not going to make him particularly popular. There is at least one likely assassination attempt, and he leaves for Medina. He stays there for about 10 years before returning to Mecca. Now, sometimes we're told this is a battle. Other sources tell us that the return to Mecca was basically the people of Mecca throwing open the doors and more or less accepting Muhammad and his ideas. And one other term I want to deal with is jihad. Jihad is not a holy war. It is a struggle against barriers or odds, a search for a better place. Really, Muhammad's life after the revelations begin is a jihad. So please do not mistake jihad as a holy war. It is a much larger term than that. So what we're going to see is Islam will expand rapidly. Just in his lifetime, you see that red area where Islam will expand, and then it's going to follow those trade routes. Islam is both a military powerhouse as well as a religious form. Within 30 years of his death, it's expanded to take over almost all of the Middle East, into North Africa, all of ancient Egypt, the Holy Lands, etc. And then within another 100 years or so, it expands from Spain all the way into northern India, basically taking over areas that the Byzantine Empire is losing, and also taking over the Persian Empire, which is a huge help in terms of the development of Islam. Now, of course, I need to deal with the Quran real briefly. This contains the sacred scriptures of Islam, and the Quran is not written by Muhammad. In the time of Muhammad, all of these recitations are an oral tradition. They're written down about 100 years. The official form that we see today is about 100 years after the death of Muhammad. Now, this is not unusual. After all, many of the ideas of the Bible start as oral tradition before being written down many, many years later. And the Quran is the sacred scripture of Islam, although they do accept parts of the Bible and the Torah as sacred scripture as well. It's written in Kufic script with wide pages, which allow for multiple readers, because books are very expensive, and part of Islam is you must be literate in Arabic. You must be able to read the Quran. Therefore, you're going to make the book larger so you can have 4, 5, 6 people crowded around it, reading it at the same time. And as we look at sort of the timeline, we have the Bible written, we have the Latin Vulgate, and then we can see that the Quran is going to be written, the green is the Revelations, but then the Quran is written after that. The Quran also warns strongly of idolatry, so that's where the aniconic element comes in. They don't allow images of specific people in holy spaces, although there are some exceptions. I'm not going to really deal with them in this class because that gets into a whole different area of study.